I didn't understand what favoritism really was until I was old enough to stop asking questions. By then, the pattern had already set like wet cement. I'm Claire Whitman. I'm 33 now, but this story doesn't start with adulthood. It starts much earlier in a quiet house in Seattle where some children are seen and others simply exist. That difference doesn't announce itself loudly. It shows up in small, ordinary moments you don't recognize as damage until years later. We lived in a narrow two-story home north of downtown, the kind with gray siding that always looked slightly damp from the rain. Mornings smelled like burnt toast and brewed coffee. My father, Robert, read the paper at the kitchen counter. My mother, Elaine, moved between rooms already tired. Megan, my younger sister, sat closest to the window. Light always seemed to find her first. When she talked, both of them looked up. When I spoke, they kept eating. I learned to stop repeating myself. At school, Megan's drawings went on the fridge. Mine stayed in my backpack until the paper curled. When she wanted piano lessons, the check was written that afternoon. When I asked to join a debate club, my father didn't even look at the flyer. He said money was tight that year. The next week, a new laptop appeared on Megan's desk. I watched him plug it in for her, his hands careful, patient. I stood in the doorway and waited to be dismissed. I worked small jobs early, library shelves, tutoring, anything that kept me out of the house and out of the way. Silence became useful. It kept things smooth. Inside, I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself independence was a choice. Years later, I would realize it wasn't. It was adaptation. I learned early that asking was useless. They had already decided who mattered. Silence followed me into adulthood, but it changed shape when I started taking the bus downtown on Fridays. I told my parents it was for school projects, which wasn't untrue, just incomplete. The ride dropped me near Elliott Bay, where the air smelled like salt and diesel and wet wood. The buildings opened up their glass and steel catching light even on gray days. That was where my grandfather lived, Henry Caldwell. He never asked why I came so often. He only opened the door wider. His loft sat above the water high enough that the ferry horn sounded distant, like something remembered rather than happening. The first thing you noticed was the quiet. Not the empty kind, but the settled kind, the kind that doesn't rush you. He kept the windows clean. Light slid across the floor in long bands catching dust I didn't mind seeing. I would set my backpack down by the door and exhale without realizing I'd been holding my breath all week. He watched that too. He always noticed things people thought were invisible. Henry didn't praise loudly. He didn't clap or raise his voice. He'd pour tea into mismatched mugs, slide one across the table, and wait. When I talked, he listened with his whole body, chin down, eyes steady, no interruptions. When I finished, he nodded once like he'd been confirming something he already suspected. The first time I brought home a report card, he didn't comment on the grades. He asked how I'd earned them. That question stayed with me longer than any compliment would have. He taught me chess on a board that had lost its gloss. The pieces were heavy, worn smooth by years of use. He never corrected my moves right away. He let me lose first. Then he showed me why. He tapped the board with one finger, quiet, deliberate. "Think 3 moves ahead," he said. People reveal themselves when they think they're safe. I didn't know then how literal that lesson would become. I just learned to sit still and watch. Weekends, there had a rhythm. I read on the couch while he worked at the piano without playing a note, dusting keys he hadn't touched in years. Sometimes he told stories about the city before it polished itself, about deals made in back rooms and favors remembered decades later. He never named names. He didn't need to. When my parents skipped my college graduation, he was there. I saw him in the back row, hands folded, already standing when my name was called. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just met my eyes and held them. One evening, as the sun dropped low over the bay, he handed me an envelope without explanation. Inside was a copy of a property deed. He watched my face carefully as I read it. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. He nodded, satisfied, and said quietly, "Never show your hand first." He paused, then added, "Especially to family." The ferry horn sounded below us, long and low. I folded the paper once, then again, and slid it back into the envelope. I understood then that safety wasn't something you asked for. It was something someone chose to give you. and he had just made that choice. The loft felt different after Henry was gone. The quiet stayed, but it no longer waited for footsteps. I stopped taking the bus on Fridays. There was nowhere to arrive to. When the call came from the lawyer's office, it didn't feel urgent, just procedural. A voice asking me to confirm a time and address in downtown Seattle, a reminder to bring identification. I wrote it down on the back of an envelope and set it beside the sink. The kettle clicked off on its own. Steam lifted and vanished. That was how things ended with him without announcement. The law office sat on the 8th floor of a glass building that reflected the sky instead of revealing what was inside. The lobby smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and paper. My parents were already there when I arrived. Robert stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back. Elaine sat rigid in a leather chair, her purse balanced carefully on her knees. Megan wasn't with them. I noticed that first. No one mentioned it. We nodded at each other the way strangers do when they recognize a face but don't know how to greet it. The attorney, a gray-haired man with careful diction, guided us into a conference room. The table was too long for the number of people present. Folders were stacked neatly at one end. A box of tissues sat untouched in the center. The blinds were half open, letting in a strip of pale winter light that cut across the tabletop. I took the seat closest to the door. Old habit. The attorney cleared his throat and began reading in a measured voice, pausing only to turn pages. He spoke of Henry's sound mind, of witnesses, of dates and signatures. Words like sole beneficiary and unencumbered landed quietly and stayed there. When he said my name, I felt my shoulders tighten then settle. No one reacted, no intake of breath, no protest. Just the hum of the building's ventilation and the soft scrape of a pen being set down. I kept my eyes on the grain of the wood in front of me, counting the lines until they steadied. The deed was slid across the table toward me. The paper was heavier than I expected. My father didn't reach for it. My mother didn't look at it. They stared straight ahead, expressions fixed as if watching something far away. I signed where I was told, my hand steady, my signature smaller than usual. The attorney nodded once, satisfied, and closed the folder. That was it. No speech, no conditions, no discussion. The loft was mine, entirely, without explanation. We stood to leave. Chairs shifted. Coats were pulled on. Elaine brushed past me without a word, her perfume lingering briefly in the air before fading. Robert held the door open but didn't meet my eyes. There was no congratulations, no acknowledgement at all. The silence felt intentional, not awkward, as if speaking might give the moment weight they weren't ready to carry. I stepped into the hallway alone and waited for the elevator. On the ride down, I watched the numbers light up one by one. 8, 7, 6. My reflection stared back at me from the mirrored wall, older than I felt, calmer than I expected. I pressed my thumb against the envelope in my coat pocket, feeling the sharp edge of the paper inside. It grounded me. Outside, traffic moved steadily indifferent, life continuing without pause. I walked 3 blocks before stopping. The city sounded the same as it always had, buses breaking, voices overlapping, a gull crying somewhere overhead. Nothing had changed. And yet something had. For the first time, I held something no one could reframe, reassign, or quietly take over. It was the first thing in my life no one could redirect. I didn't know then that silence would be their answer, and that it wouldn't last. The silence after the lawyer's office followed me home, but it didn't stay contained. It stretched. It waited. A week later, I drove out to Bellevue with a box of old papers in the trunk, documents Henry had kept neatly labeled, things I thought my parents might want to file away. The neighborhood hadn't changed. Trim hedges, wide driveways, houses set back from the street as if privacy were a right you could buy. I parked where I always had and sat for a moment with the engine off, listening to it tick as it cooled. I told myself this was practical, nothing more. The front door was unlocked. That should have warned me. Inside the house smelled like lemon polish and something warm from the oven. Late afternoon light lay flat across the hardwood floors, catching dust near the baseboards. I called out once. No answer. Voices drifted from the kitchen, low and intent, the kind that carry when people assume they're alone. I stopped in the hallway, the box balanced against my hip, and waited for a natural pause that never came. My father spoke first, calm, methodical. He said my name the way you might say an address. Once Claire leaves for Europe, we'll handle it, he said. I heard the scrape of a chair, the soft click of something set down his watch, maybe. My mother answered without hesitation. 3 weeks is enough, she said. Locksmith movers photos. The words stacked neatly one after the other. My grip tightened on the cardboard edge until it bent. They talked about timing, about the concierge, about how easy it would be if it looked empty. Someone mentioned a realtor by name. Someone else said the market was good right now. I shifted my weight, careful not to let the floor creak. The box felt heavier by the second. I focused on my breathing slow, in slower, out the way Henry had taught me when a board position went wrong and you needed time to see it clearly. Then Megan's name came up and the tone changed. My mother's voice softened. She's drowning, she said. The cards, the trip last spring. It's too much. My father didn't argue. He filled in numbers instead. Amounts, deadlines. The loft wasn't spoken of as a home. It was inventory, an asset. Something to be moved quickly to plug a hole. I felt a small, precise ache just under my ribs, sharp enough to be specific. She'll survive, my mother said finally. Megan won't. The sentence landed cleanly without drama. No one challenged it. No one asked permission. I stood there and counted the seconds it took for that truth to settle. 10, 11, 12. The house made its ordinary sounds around me, the hum of the refrigerator, a clock ticking somewhere deeper inside, indifferent to what was being decided. They discussed who could help. A cousin practical and nearby someone who wouldn't ask questions if told it was temporary. My father mentioned waiting until after my flight so there would be no interruptions. He said it the way you'd say you'd wait until traffic died down. I swallowed and tasted metal. My hands were steady. That surprised me. Inside, something had gone very quiet. I didn't move when the conversation shifted to dinner plans. I didn't wait to hear the end. I eased the box down inch by inch until it rested against the wall. Then I stepped back the way I'd come, careful with each footfall. Outside, the air was cooler than I expected. The sky had dimmed while I was inside, the light flattening toward evening. I walked to my car without rushing and sat behind the wheel with both hands resting at 10 and 2 like I was waiting for instructions. I drove home along the same route I always took. The radio stayed off. Traffic flowed. Nothing about the world signaled that a line had just been crossed. By the time I reached the loft, the initial shock had burned down to something steadier. They hadn't planned to ask, they had planned to act. And they were waiting for me to leave so they could do it without resistance. I didn't confront them after that. I didn't call. I didn't ask for an explanation. The quiet felt deliberate now, like a door I chose not to open yet. Back at the loft, I went through my routine slowly. I washed a mug I hadn't used. I straightened a stack of mail. Outside, the bay moved the way it always had, gray and patient ferries cutting clean lines through the water. My hands worked automatically while my mind replayed their voices, not the words themselves, but the ease with which they had said them. What stayed with me wasn't the plan, it was the tone. They spoke about my life the way people talk about logistics, neutral, efficient, settled. There was no malice in it, no raised voices. That made it worse. When my father mentioned calling a cousin to help sort through my things, he said her name casually like this had been discussed before. My mother agreed without pause. No one asked whether it was right. No one wondered how I might feel. The absence of hesitation was the answer. I sat at the kitchen table and pulled a legal pad toward me, though I didn't write anything yet. The pen rested between my fingers. I noticed a small tremor and tightened my grip until it stopped. This wasn't the first time my needs had been weighed and found inconvenient. It was just the first time the stakes were concrete. The loft wasn't an idea. It wasn't approval. It was a place. Walls, locks, keys, and they were already assigning it a different purpose. They hadn't framed it as theft. That was clear. In their minds, they were fixing an imbalance, correcting a decision that no longer served the family as they defined it. Megan's debt had become the emergency. My stability had become excess. When you grow up learning to stay quiet, people mistake your silence for consent. I had given them years of evidence that I wouldn't interfere. This was simply the next logical step. The thought landed slowly, like something heavy being set down. I wasn't the obstacle because I'd done something wrong. I was the obstacle because I existed. If I had been less self-sufficient, less contained, maybe they would have felt more comfortable taking care of me. Instead, they saw independence as flexibility, something that could bend without breaking. I pressed my tongue to the roof of my mouth and breathed through my nose until the room steadied again. That evening, I walked the length of the loft room by room, noticing details I'd taken for granted. The scratch on the doorframe from when Henry moved the piano. The plant by the window that leaned toward the light no matter how often I turned it. I opened drawers not to check what was inside, but to feel their resistance the way they closed flush when pushed gently. These were not abstractions. These were facts. And facts mattered. I thought about the cousin they'd named. Practical. Nearby. Someone who would help without asking too many questions if told it was temporary. I wondered what version of the story they would give her. Probably a reasonable one. Probably one that made my absence feel necessary. People don't volunteer for wrongdoing. They volunteer for solutions. I understood that now with an uncomfortable clarity. By the time night settled in, my plan hadn't formed yet, but my position had. I wasn't angry. I wasn't panicking. I was clear. They weren't stealing from me. In their minds, they were correcting a mistake, and that meant they would move forward without warning, without apology, and without stopping, unless something forced them to. By Sunday, the clarity had settled into something usable. I slept 8, went to work, answered emails. Nothing on the surface changed. That morning, I drove to my parents' house for dinner the way I always had hands steady on the wheel, radio low. The sky over Bellevue hung heavy and colorless, the kind that presses down without rain. I parked in the same spot, straightened my jacket, and took a breath before going in. The plan wasn't complicated. It just required patience. The house smelled like roasted chicken and rosemary. My mother moved between the stove and the counter, precise as ever. My father stood near the sink, drying his hands with a towel he'd used too many times already. Megan was there, sitting at the table, phone face down beside her plate. She looked up when I entered and smiled quickly, like a reflex she'd practiced. We exchanged the usual greetings. Nothing lingered. The clock over the doorway ticked louder than it needed to. We sat. Plates were passed. Conversation stayed shallow weather traffic and neighbors' new fence. I waited until the main course, until the rhythm of chewing and refilling glasses smoothed everything out. Then I mentioned it casually, as if it had just occurred to me. A client meeting in Europe. London first, then Berlin. 3 weeks. I kept my voice light and my eyes on my plate, cutting chicken into even pieces. The fork paused in my mother's hand. 3 weeks, she said, repeating it softly. My father looked up, then interested in a way he hadn't been all evening. He asked about dates, departure time, return window. I answered without rushing, offering details that sounded rehearsed because they were. Megan smiled again, too fast, and said it sounded exciting. She asked where I'd be staying. Hotel near the office district. Nothing fancy. Convenient. I took a sip of water and set the glass down carefully. They asked about practicalities next. Mail, plants, the building. My father mentioned security, his tone neutral but attentive. I explained the smart locks, the app, the concierge. I said the system sent alerts if anything was off. I said it all plainly without emphasis. No one needs access, I added as if it were an afterthought. My mother nodded. My father nodded. Megan nodded too, a fraction of a second behind the others. It felt choreographed. Dessert came out, Megan's favorite. The room warmed with the smell of cinnamon and baked apples. My parents asked about the flight again, about layovers, about jet lag. I answered and waited, noticing the way my father folded his napkin when he was thinking, the way my mother's eyes tracked details she didn't comment on. Megan didn't eat much. She checked her phone once, then slid it back into her pocket. Her smile stayed in place, but it didn't reach her eyes. When it was time to leave, my mother hugged me longer than usual. My father wished me safe travels. Megan said to send pictures. I nodded, said I would. Outside, the air felt cooler than it should have. I sat in my car and watched the house through the windshield as lights shifted inside, figures moving from room to room. Nothing about it looked urgent. That was the point. I drove home slowly, letting the city pass me by. The announcement had landed exactly where I needed it to. They believed I would be gone far enough away to be irrelevant. By the time I reached the loft, my phone buzzed with a message from Megan. A single word. Exciting. I set the phone face down on the counter and stood there in the quiet, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. They had the timeline they wanted. I had something else. I didn't pack for Europe. The suitcase I left by the hallway stayed half-empty, clothes folded neatly on top, tags still on a jacket I wouldn't need. On the morning of my supposed departure, I drove past the airport exit without slowing down and kept going until the skyline tightened around me. The hotel sat a few blocks from downtown, the kind business travelers used when they didn't want attention. Neutral carpet, soft lighting, a desk by the window. I checked in under my own name without hesitation. Hiding wasn't the point. The room overlooked a narrow street where buses sighed as they stopped and moved on. The sound was steady, predictable. I set my bag down, closed the curtains halfway, and sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, feeling the weight of the day settle into my shoulders. This wasn't fear. It was focus. I opened my laptop and logged into the building's security system, watching the familiar camera angles load one by one. The lobby, the elevator bank, my floor. Everything looked exactly as it should. That afternoon, I drove back to the loft using the service entrance parking where my car wouldn't be noticed. The building smelled faintly of cleaning solution and warm air. Inside my unit, the light fell the same way it always had, angled low across the floor. I moved carefully, methodically. The cameras were small, legal, and easy to place if you knew where to look. Living room corner, hallway shelf, kitchen ledge. I adjusted angles until entry points were clear and blind spots disappeared. Each soft click as a device locked into place sounded louder than it was. I tested the system twice, walking through the space, slowly triggering motion alerts, checking audio levels. The app responded immediately, time-stamped, stored remotely. Nothing could be altered from inside the unit. When I finished, I stood still and listened. The building hummed around me, unaware. I locked the door behind me and didn't look back. That evening, from the hotel desk, I called the non-emergency line. The officer's voice was calm, professional. I explained what I had overheard, keeping my tone even. I told him about the plan, the locksmith, the intent to remove belongings and list the property. When he asked for proof, I played the recording I had kept. There was a pause on the other end, then questions: ownership, timing, location. I answered each one without filling the silence between them. He told me what would happen next. A report filed, units notified, instructions on what to do if alerts triggered. I shared the secure camera link, the timestamps, the expected window based on my departure. He thanked me for calling ahead, said it made a difference. When the call ended, my hand lingered on the phone longer than necessary. Reporting family felt strange. Necessary things often do. The next day passed slowly. I worked on actual client files, answering emails, joining calls with my camera off. Outside, clouds moved low and heavy, pressing the light flat against the buildings. I ordered room service and ate without tasting much. Every so often, I checked the feed. Stillness, elevators opening and closing, neighbors coming and going, normal life continuing at its own pace. That night, sleep came in short stretches. Each time I woke, I checked the app. Nothing yet. I lay back and stared at the ceiling, listening to traffic below. I thought about Henry's chessboard, about letting the other person move first. This wasn't about catching anyone in the act for satisfaction. It was about clarity, about making sure that when they crossed the line, it would be visible to everyone involved. By morning, I felt settled. The waiting had stripped everything down to its essentials. Whatever happened next would be recorded, documented, irrefutable. I wasn't planning revenge. I was preparing evidence. The alert came mid-morning, soft but insistent, my phone vibrating against the hotel desk. I was reading an email when it happened. I didn't rush. I closed the message first, then turned my attention to the screen. The lobby camera loaded slowly as it always did, then sharpened into focus. A white van rolled into frame and stopped at the curb. The logo on the side was familiar. Local locksmith. My jaw tightened just enough to notice. My parents appeared a moment later, walking with purpose, my father a step ahead of my mother. He spoke to the driver, briefly gesturing toward the building entrance. The man nodded, lifted his bag, and followed them inside. I watched the elevator camera next. Doors slid open. They stepped in together. My mother looked up once, scanning the ceiling, then away. The doors closed. I felt my pulse in my throat and pressed my tongue against my teeth until it eased. The hallway feed triggered as they reached my floor. The locksmith knelt by my door tools laid out neatly on the carpet. My father stood close, arms crossed, blocking the view down the hall. My mother held a stack of flattened boxes against her chest. Megan arrived seconds later carrying more boxes, her movements quick and practiced. She didn't look at the door. She looked at her phone. The lock clicked once, then again. The sound came through the audio feed, sharp and unmistakable. When the door opened, they filed in without hesitation. My father entered first. Megan went straight to the bedroom. My mother moved toward the kitchen, opening cabinets, pulling out drawers. Boxes unfolded, tape ripped. The quiet efficiency of it all was what struck me most. No one paused. No one questioned what they were doing. They worked like people who believed they were entitled to the space. I watched Megan stack clothes into bags, folding quickly, carelessly. My mother wrapped dishes in paper towels, the ones Henry had used every morning. My father stood near the window phone to his ear, voice low but clear through the audio. He mentioned photos, listings, a timeline. "Yes," he said, nodding. "It's empty now." He glanced around the room as if confirming it. Then he added, "List it this week." The locksmith finished resetting the lock from inside, testing the handle once more. My father handed him an envelope. They spoke briefly. The man nodded again and left, unaware of what he'd just stepped into. I didn't move. I watched my mother direct Megan toward another room, pointing efficient. The apartment I had walked through the night before was already changing shape. It felt smaller on the screen, crowded by intention. My hands were steady when I reached for the phone. I dialed the number I'd been given and spoke when the officer answered. I described what was happening as I watched it happen. He didn't interrupt. He told me units were already nearby. "Stay on the line." I set the phone down beside the laptop camera feed, still live, and waited. The knock came sooner than I expected. Firm. Official. The sound carried through the microphone and into the room where they froze mid-motion. My father turned first. His face drained of color so quickly it was almost impressive. My mother dropped a box. Items spilled across the floor. Megan stood still, one hand gripping a hanger, the other trembling just enough to be visible. When the officers stepped inside, the space seemed to contract around them. I watched it all from the hotel desk, the screen glowing in the dim room. There was no shouting, no drama, just questions, IDs, explanations that unraveled as evidence played back. The recording cut through the room cleanly, their own voices filling the space they thought was empty. The line had been crossed exactly where I knew it would be, and this time there was no one left to pretend it hadn't happened. The feed didn't cut when the officers stepped fully inside. It widened, catching angles I hadn't paid attention to before the edge of the rug turned up the half-filled boxes leaning against the wall the way light from the windows flattened everything into pale gray. One officer spoke first, his voice even practiced. He asked them to step back from the doorway and identify themselves. My father tried to answer quickly, too quickly, words overlapping. He said family more than once, as if repetition might turn it into permission. The second officer asked who owned the unit. There was a pause, then long enough to register. My mother glanced at my father. Megan looked down at the floor. No one answered directly. The officer repeated the question slower this time. When my father finally spoke, he said my name, followed by a qualifier, daughter, as if that completed the thought. The officer nodded once, then asked if they had written authorization. No one moved. They separated them gently, methodically, like people used to scenes that pretended to be calmer than they were. IDs were collected, notes were taken. The locksmith was called back in and stood awkwardly by the door, his tool bag still slung over one shoulder. He explained who had hired him and when. He said he'd been told the owner was out of the country. He said it plainly without embellishment. I watched my mother press her lips together and look away. When the recording played, the room changed. Their voices filled the space, familiar and unmistakable. My father's careful phrasing, my mother's certainty. The timeline laid out cleanly, step by step. No one interrupted it. The officers let it run. Megan's face drained of color as the words repeated themselves back into the room. The sound of the ferry horn outside cut through the silence at the end, long and low like punctuation. My father tried again, this time softer. He said it was a misunderstanding. He said family had access. The officer closest to him shook his head slightly, not unkindly. Family access doesn't override ownership, he said. The sentence landed with a finality I could feel even through the screen. There was nothing dramatic about it. That was what made it stick. Citations were issued. Criminal trespass. Unauthorized entry. The language was precise, stripped of emotion. Boxes were photographed where they stood, the disturbed drawers, the reset lock, everything documented. My mother's hands shook as she signed the paperwork. Megan started to cry, quietly soundless on the feed, shoulders moving while she stared at nothing. My father went silent, his jaw set, eyes unfocused. He had run out of explanations. The officers told them they needed to leave immediately and not return without explicit permission. They were clear about the consequences if they did. The locksmith lingered, apologetic, then followed them out, shaking his head. The door closed behind them with a soft, ordinary sound. The apartment fell quiet again, the kind of quiet that follows something irreversible. I sat back in the hotel chair and let the screen dim. My hands were resting flat on the desk, palms down. I noticed the imprint of the wood grain against my skin and pressed there for a second longer than necessary. This wasn't relief. It wasn't triumph. It was recognition. The truth had moved out of private spaces and into record. Later that evening, the building app buzzed with notifications, neighbors asking about police activity, someone warning others to check their locks. The story traveled faster than I expected, carried by small observations and speculation. By morning, messages had reached Megan's office, questions were asked, meetings scheduled. The consequences spread outward, touching places I wasn't in control of anymore. And for the first time, I understood how silence can be louder once it's been documented. The loft felt larger when I came back to it, not because anything had changed, but because nothing was pressing in anymore. Night had settled over Elliott Bay, the water dark and steady, fairy lights sliding across the surface in slow lines. I turned on only the lamp by the window. The rest of the space stayed dim outlines, soft, familiar. The door closed behind me with a quiet click, and for the first time since this began, I didn't listen for footsteps afterward. The legal part ended the way Henry's lawyer said it would. Brief hearings, filed motions, words like ironclad and dismissed spoken without emphasis. My parents' challenge didn't hold. There wasn't enough room in the will for interpretation and no patience in the court for intentions that arrived too late. They were ordered to cover costs. It was handled in offices that smelled like paper and coffee under lights that never flickered. I attended when required, answered when asked, and left without staying to explain anything. There was nothing left to clarify. After that, the calls slowed, then stopped. Megan sent one message I didn't open. My parents didn't send any. Silence returned, but it was different now. It wasn't waiting. It wasn't loaded. It was simply there. I changed the locks again, upgraded the system, and signed a few documents at the building office. The concierge nodded when I passed. Neighbors offered brief smiles that didn't ask questions. Life narrowed to manageable edges. One evening, weeks later, I was reorganizing Henry's old study. The desk drawers still carried his order pencils, sharpened evenly, paper squared. Behind a stack of files, I found an envelope I hadn't seen before. My name was written across the front in his careful hand. The paper had yellowed slightly at the corners. I stood there longer than necessary before opening it, listening to the low hum of the city below. The letter was short. No legal language, no instructions. He wrote about watching me learn to stand on my own, about how strength doesn't announce itself, how some people mistake quiet for absence. He said the loft was meant to be a place where I didn't have to shrink. Near the end, his handwriting tightened the way it did when he wanted to be precise. "You were never invisible," he wrote. "They just chose not to see you." I sat in his chair by the window and held the page with both hands. My breathing changed shallow at first, then steadier. I pressed my thumb against the crease in the paper where it had been folded and unfolded before. Outside, a fairy horn sounded distant and familiar. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. The words settled where they belonged, filling a space I hadn't named before. I never responded to Megan's message. I blocked my parents' numbers without ceremony. It wasn't punishment. It was maintenance. Boundaries once drawn require upkeep. The family group chat went quiet without my exit being announced. I noticed its absence weeks later and didn't replace it with anything. Some doors don't need closing statements. The loft became what Henry intended. I worked late with the lights low and the bay moving below me. I hosted friends who didn't ask careful questions. I planted another lemon tree on the balcony, setting the pot where the light reached it first. When I locked the door at night, the sound was ordinary, unremarkable. That mattered more than I expected. I tell this story now without raising my voice, without smoothing the edges. Not because it still hurts the same way, but because it doesn't. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was earned, and for the first time it belonged to me.